Antinatalism claims that procreation is ethically wrong or unjustifiable in all cases. This philosophical position argues humans should abstain from creating new people. Some antinatalists extend this claim to all sentient creatures capable of suffering. The view assigns negative value to the act of bringing conscious beings into existence. This position differs fundamentally from government population control policies or personal child-free preferences. Philosophical antinatalism makes a universal moral claim about reproduction itself. The term emerged in contemporary academic discourse around 2006. Belgian writer Théophile de Giraud likely first used it in his manifesto that year. Japanese philosopher Masahiro Morioka defines it as the thought that sentient beings should not be born. South African philosopher David Benatar provided the most influential contemporary systematic defense. His 2006 book, Better Never to Have Been, crystallized antinatalist arguments into rigorous philosophical form. The position now occupies a recognized place in academic moral philosophy. Antinatalism divides into two main argumentative branches with distinct moral foundations. Philanthropic antinatalism concerns itself with harm done to individuals brought into existence. It operates from compassion for potential people who would experience suffering. Misanthropic antinatalism focuses on harm that humans inflict on others and the environment. Both conclude that procreation is wrong, but arrive through different ethical reasoning chains. These arguments can operate independently or reinforce each other in combined cases. The position provokes intense emotional and intellectual reactions from most people who encounter it. This response makes evolutionary sense, given reproduction sustains all biological life. Antinatalists expect resistance and consider it evidence of cognitive biases favoring existence. They argue rational examination of procreation ethics requires suspending these evolutionary imperatives. The philosophical challenge demands evaluating existence itself from an impartial standpoint. This proves exceptionally difficult given all evaluators already exist. Part 1. Historical Roots and Philosophical Foundations. Antinatalist sentiments appear throughout recorded human intellectual history across multiple civilizations. Ancient Greek philosophy contains explicit expressions of birth negation as preferable to existence. Sophocles wrote that not being born is best for mortals in all ways. The tragedian Hegesias of Cyrene argued so persuasively against life's value that Athens banned his lectures. Students reportedly took their own lives after hearing his philosophical arguments. Ancient pessimism about human existence emerged independently in multiple philosophical traditions. Ancient Indian philosophy developed sophisticated arguments against rebirth within Buddhist and Hindu frameworks. Early Buddhists sought escape from samsara, the endless cycle of death and rebirth. Existence itself was understood as dukkha, a term encompassing suffering, dissatisfaction, and impermanence. Achieving nirvana meant cessation of this cycle rather than continuation in another form. The goal was ending the production of new, conscious experience entirely. This represents rebirth negation rather than direct procreation negation, but shares conceptual ground with antinatalism. Early Christianity and Gnosticism contained strands of existence-denying thought despite their general pronatalism. Certain Gnostic sects viewed material creation as fundamentally evil or flawed. The Cathars of medieval Europe interpreted commandments against killing to include procreation itself. They recommended vegetarianism and celibacy to avoid perpetuating suffering through new births. Manichaeism similarly taught that spirit trapped in matter sought liberation through non-procreation. These religious movements were suppressed partly due to their anti-reproductive doctrines. Arthur Schopenhauer provides the most important 19th-century philosophical foundation for modern antinatalism. His 1818 work, The World as Will and Representation, established philosophical pessimism's systematic basis. Schopenhauer argued that a blind, irrational force he called will constitutes reality's fundamental nature. This will manifests as insatiable striving and desire in all living things. Satisfaction of desire produces only brief pleasure before new wants emerge. The absence of satisfied desire generates suffering, while fulfillment brings temporary relief, then boredom. Human existence oscillates endlessly between pain of unfulfilled desire and emptiness of temporary satisfaction. Schopenhauer described life as swinging like a pendulum between suffering and boredom. He claimed that measuring life's suffering against its pleasures reveals profound disproportion. The moments of happiness never compensate for the relentless struggles, anxieties, and inevitable decline. He asked whether pure reason alone would choose to continue the human race. His answer implied no rational being would deliberately choose existence over non-existence. Schopenhauer distinguished between positive and negative experiences in a way that influences contemporary antinatalism. He argued that pain and suffering possess positive reality as actual conscious states. Happiness, by contrast, represents merely the absence or temporary relief from suffering. We experience desire as painful lack that dominates consciousness. Satisfaction brings only negative pleasure through pain's momentary cessation. This asymmetry between suffering's positive reality and happiness's negative character becomes crucial for later arguments. Norwegian philosopher Peter Wessel Zapffe extended Schopenhauerian pessimism in a biological and existential direction. His 1941 doctoral dissertation on the tragic argued that human consciousness itself constitutes an evolutionary error. Evolution equipped humans with cognitive capacities far exceeding what survival and reproduction require. This excess consciousness allows humans to recognize life's meaninglessness and inevitable death. Unlike other animals whose mental lives fit harmoniously with their biological needs, humans suffer existential awareness. We possess the curse of understanding that existence has no inherent purpose or justification. Zapffe proposed that humans employ 4 psychological mechanisms to cope with this unbearable awareness. Isolation involves mentally separating disturbing thoughts from everyday consciousness. Anchoring creates fixed points of meaning through dedication to values, ideals, or institutions. Distraction keeps the mind occupied with trivialities to prevent existential reflection. Sublimation channels existential dread into creative or intellectual pursuits. These mechanisms allow humans to function despite awareness that should logically paralyze action. Zapfe concluded that the ethical response to this human predicament requires voluntary extinction. His essay, The Last Messiah, describes a figure who fully comprehends existence's tragic nature. This Messiah would preach an opposite message from traditional religious figures. Rather than commanding humans to be fruitful and multiply, he would say, "Be infertile and silent." Zapfe summarized his view with the metaphor that bearing children resembles carrying wood to a burning house. He remained childless throughout his life, as consistent with his philosophical convictions. The distinction between Schopenhauer and Zapfe reveals different routes to antinatalist conclusions. Schopenhauer grounded his pessimism in metaphysical claims about will as reality's fundamental nature. Zapfe based his argument on biological and evolutionary analysis of human cognitive development. Schopenhauer emphasized the inherent suffering in all willing and desire. Zapfe focused on the specific mismatch between human consciousness and nature's design. Both concluded that preventing new human existence would prevent unnecessary suffering. Contemporary antinatalism emerged as a systematic academic position primarily through David Benatar's work. Before 2006, antinatalist ideas existed scattered across philosophy without unified argumentation. Benatar's Better Never to Have Been provided rigorous analytic arguments with clear logical structure. He distinguished philanthropic arguments focused on harm to created beings from misanthropic arguments about harm they cause. This taxonomy organized previously disparate objections to procreation into coherent philosophical framework. The book sparked extensive academic debate and brought antinatalism into mainstream ethical philosophy. Benatar's central philanthropic claim states that coming into existence always constitutes serious harm. This counterintuitive conclusion rests on an asymmetry between pain and pleasure regarding existence. The argument requires careful examination of how we evaluate existence versus non-existence. It challenges common assumptions about the relationship between being born and benefiting from life. The asymmetry argument attempts to show that even good lives represent net harms to their subjects. Understanding this argument requires grasping several subtle distinctions about value and harm. Part 2. Benatar's asymmetry argument, the core contemporary case. Benatar's asymmetry argument constitutes the most discussed and debated antinatalist position in contemporary philosophy. The argument claims that a fundamental asymmetry exists between how we should evaluate pain and pleasure. This asymmetry leads to the conclusion that existence is always comparatively worse than non-existence. The argument operates through careful analysis of what is good or bad in two different scenarios. Scenario A involves a person who exists and experiences both pleasure and pain. Scenario B involves that same person never coming into existence at all. Benatar proposes 4 propositions that form the asymmetry's foundation. First, the presence of pain in an existing person's life is bad for that person. Second, the presence of pleasure in an existing person's life is good for that person. These first 2 propositions appear uncontroversial and most people accept them readily. The third proposition states that the absence of pain is good even when no one exists to enjoy that good. The fourth proposition claims that the absence of pleasure is not bad unless someone exists to be deprived of it. The asymmetry emerges clearly from comparing propositions 3 and 4 about non-existence. Absent pain counts as good even without a beneficiary to experience this goodness. Absent pleasure does not count as bad when no person exists to suffer the deprivation. This creates an evaluative imbalance that favours never existing over existing. An existing person faces both good things like pleasure and bad things like pain. A non-existent person avoids bad things without this absence, counting as a loss. Benatar argues this asymmetry explains several widely shared moral intuitions about procreation. We recognize a moral duty not to create people who would live miserable, suffering-filled lives. However, we do not recognize a corresponding duty to create happy people. If someone chooses not to have children, we do not judge them for depriving potential happy people of existence. But we would judge someone who deliberately created a child destined for severe suffering. This asymmetry in our duties makes sense only if absent pleasure differs morally from absent pain. Another supporting intuition involves our attitudes towards suffering versus happiness on distant planets. Suppose we discovered that Mars contained millions of sentient beings experiencing terrible ongoing suffering. We would consider this deeply troubling and bad that such suffering exists. We would think it good that in reality Mars contains no suffering beings. Now suppose instead that Mars simply lacks any happy beings but contains no suffering either. We do not feel sadness that happy beings are absent from Mars in this neutral scenario. The asymmetry also illuminates our reasoning about bringing children into existence in different circumstances. Consider prospective parents deciding whether to have a child who would experience some disability. If the disability would cause significant suffering, we think they have reason not to procreate. We appeal to the suffering the child would experience as counting against creating that child. But if parents choose not to have a child who would be very happy, we do not say something bad has occurred. The absence of that happy person does not register as a genuine loss or deprivation. Benatar further argues that his asymmetry explains strange features of our reasoning about population size. We think it bad to bring into existence a population whose lives would contain predominantly suffering. But we do not think it equally good to bring into existence a population whose lives would contain predominantly pleasure. Adding happy people to the world seems less morally pressing than preventing miserable people from existing. This makes sense if absent pain is good, but absent pleasure is merely neutral. The asymmetry provides unified explanation for these otherwise puzzling moral judgments. Critics object that Benatar equivocates between different senses of good and bad throughout his argument. When he says the presence of pain is bad, he means bad for the person who experiences it. But when he says the absence of pain is good, he might mean good in an impersonal sense. If the absence of pain is only impersonally good, it cannot be compared to personally experienced pleasure. The argument requires that goods and bads be evaluated on the same scale. Mixing personal and impersonal value assessments may undermine the crucial comparison. Elizabeth Harman argues that Benatar's third and fourth propositions involve problematic reasoning about non-existence. She claims we should not assign any value to states of affairs involving complete non-existence. A person who never exists has no interests that can be satisfied or frustrated. Saying it is good that this non-existent person avoids pain makes no coherent sense. Similarly, saying the absence of pleasure is neutral for them also lacks clear meaning. The entire framework of evaluating what is good or bad for non-existent beings may be incoherent. Benatar responds that his asymmetry does not rely on impersonal versus personal value confusion. He maintains that the absence of pain is good even without someone there to benefit. This claim reflects our considered judgment that worlds without suffering are better than worlds with it. We need not identify a beneficiary for this evaluation to make sense. Regarding the fourth proposition, he argues absence of pleasure is not bad because no deprivation occurs. Without a subject to be deprived, missing out on pleasure lacks moral badness. Other critics challenge whether the asymmetry actually supports antinatalism, even if the four propositions hold true. Fumitake Yoshizawa argues that Benatar equivocates between applying the asymmetry to life's parts versus wholes. The four propositions concern specific pleasures and pains that occur during a life. But antinatalism requires evaluating whether an entire life is worth living. Benatar moves from claims about individual experiences to conclusions about existence's total value. This transition may not be logically valid, even granting the asymmetry about particular experiences. Some philosophers accept the asymmetry but reject that it establishes procreation is always wrong. They argue that even if non-existence is comparatively better, creating people is not necessarily impermissible. Kayla Draper suggests we should distinguish between making someone worse off and wronging them. Procreation might make someone worse off than non-existence without wronging them morally. The asymmetry shows existence involves net comparative harm, but not that causing this harm is unethical. Additional moral principles are needed to get from comparative disadvantage to moral impermissibility. Benatar supplements the asymmetry with what he calls the quality of life argument. He claims that humans systematically overestimate how good their lives actually are. Three psychological phenomena distort our assessment of our own well-being upward. Optimism bias causes us to view our past, present, and future more positively than warranted. Adaptation means we adjust to negative circumstances and lower our expectations accordingly. Comparison with worse-off others makes our own situation seem better than objective evaluation would suggest. These psychological mechanisms evolved to promote survival and reproduction despite life's difficulties. Natural selection favored individuals who maintained motivation to continue living and reproducing. Accurate perception of life's negative aspects would depress motivation and reduce reproductive success. Evolution thus equipped humans with cognitive biases that paint existence in rosier colors than reality justifies. We are constitutionally incapable of perceiving how bad our lives actually are. This means even people who report high life satisfaction may be deeply mistaken. Benatar lists extensive examples of suffering that humans typically minimize or ignore. Physical pain from injury, illness, and the aging process affects everyone eventually. Psychological distress from anxiety, fear, frustration, and disappointment pervades human experience. Social suffering from rejection, betrayal, loneliness, and loss touches all human lives. The awareness of mortality generates existential dread that we constantly work to suppress. The inevitability of death means that everyone loses everything they value in the end. Even lives we judge as very good contain shocking amounts of suffering when catalogued honestly. Consider the accumulated hours of physical discomfort from minor ailments throughout a lifetime. Add the countless moments of boredom, irritation, worry, and mild unhappiness that fill our days. Include the major losses, traumas, and disappointments that no human life escapes. Factor in the decline of physical and mental capacities as aging progresses. The total suffering vastly outweighs the peak positive experiences we remember selectively. Critics respond that Benatar cherry-picks negative aspects while ignoring genuine positive experiences. Michael Hauskeller argues that human lives contain substantial authentic pleasures and meaningful satisfactions. Relationships with family and friends provide real joy that is not merely relief from suffering. Creative and intellectual pursuits offer fulfillment beyond simple absence of pain. Natural beauty, music, literature, and art generate positive experiences with genuine value. These goods are not just optimistic delusions, but constitute real benefits of existence. Benatar might reply that even granting authentic positive experiences, the asymmetry still favors non-existence. The question is not whether good things exist, but whether they outweigh the bad. More importantly, the asymmetry argument shows that even lives with more pleasure than pain are comparatively harmful. Because absent pleasure is not bad, while absent pain is good, existence loses the comparison. The quality of life argument reinforces this by showing we underestimate how bad things are. Together, these arguments create a cumulative case that procreation harms those brought into existence. Part 3. Other philanthropic arguments: consent, quality of life, and non-identity problems. The consent-based argument for antinatalism focuses on the impossibility of obtaining agreement from unborn people. Siana Schifrin developed the most influential version of this argument in legal and philosophical contexts. She notes that generally we consider harming others without their consent morally problematic. Harming people without consent is permissible only when preventing greater harms to them. Procreation necessarily imposes harms on the created person without any possibility of prior consent. Since the person does not exist before procreation, they cannot be consulted about the decision. Every human life inevitably contains significant harms that could not be consented to in advance. People are forced into moral agency and required to make difficult ethical decisions. They must assume moral responsibilities and discharge demanding duties toward others. They face the burden of confronting death and the fear of their own mortality. Physical pain, emotional suffering, and existential anxiety affect all human lives without exception. Creating a person imposes all these burdens without obtaining their agreement to bear them. The consent argument differs from Benatar's asymmetry by not requiring that lives be net negative. Shiffrin acknowledges that procreation might deliver overall benefits to the person brought into existence. Nevertheless, imposing significant burdens without consent remains ethically problematic even with net benefit. The principle against unconsented harm does not dissolve just because benefits accompany the harms. Procreation violates a fundamental ethical constraint, regardless of whether life turns out well. This makes the consent argument potentially more robust than arguments depending on net harm calculation. Proponents of procreation often appeal to the concept of hypothetical consent to address this problem. They argue that people would consent if they could, so procreation is justified. Most people are glad to be alive and would retrospectively consent to their own creation. This hypothetical consent functions similarly to emergency medical treatment, where actual consent is impossible. Just as doctors may amputate to save a life without asking the unconscious patient, parents may procreate without asking the child. Both cases involve reasonable assumptions about what the affected person would want. Shiffrin and her defenders provide 4 reasons why hypothetical consent fails to justify procreation. First, no great harm is at stake if the person is not brought into existence. In emergency medical cases, hypothetical consent works because not acting would cause severe harm. But a non-existent person suffers no harm from remaining non-existent. Second, if procreation occurs, the harms the person suffers may be extremely severe. Some people endure terrible lives, while emergency medical procedures typically aim to prevent worse outcomes. Third, the imposed condition of existence cannot be escaped without extremely high costs. Once someone exists, exiting existence requires suicide, which is physically, emotionally, and morally excruciating. Emergency medical procedures do not trap people in conditions they cannot escape. Fourth, hypothetical consent in procreation is not based on the particular person's actual values. It attempts to universalize preferences that may not match the individual's real preferences. These 4 factors distinguish procreation from cases where hypothetical consent provides genuine justification. Ashil Singh develops Shiffrin's argument further by considering the endorsement objection. Many people endorse their own existence and are glad they were born. Does this retrospective approval justify their parents' decision to procreate? Singh argues that endorsement cannot retroactively make the initial imposition of harm permissible. The fact that someone adapts to a burden and comes to accept it does not mean imposing it was justified. Stockholm Syndrome victims may come to identify with their captors, but the initial kidnapping remains wrong. Moreover, people's endorsement of their existence may itself result from the psychological biases Benatar identifies. Optimism bias, adaptation, and comparison effects could produce glad endorsement of objectively bad lives. Evolutionary pressures strongly favor continued existence over suicide for reproductive success. Natural selection built humans to prefer existence even when rational evaluation might suggest otherwise. The widespread endorsement of existence might reflect these deep biological imperatives rather than accurate value assessment. We cannot take people's satisfaction with existence at face value, given these distorting influences. Gerald Harrison advances a related argument based on prima facie duties against causing harm. We have defeasible moral duties not to impose harms on others without strong justification. Procreation clearly imposes significant harms, including pain, suffering, disappointment, fear, and death. The question becomes whether sufficient justification exists to override the presumption against causing these harms. Harrison argues that no such justification is available in the case of procreation. Benefits to the created person cannot justify imposing non-consensual harms when non-existence was an option. The non-identity problem poses a unique challenge for antinatalist arguments about harming future people. Derek Parfit introduced this problem in his 1984 book, Reasons and Persons. The problem arises from the fact that identity depends on specific circumstances of conception. A child conceived at a different time or from different gametes would be numerically different person. This means we cannot coherently claim that procreation harms a particular person by bringing them into a bad life. If the parents had not procreated at that exact moment, that specific person would never have existed. The non-identity problem threatens to undermine claims that procreation harms the person brought into existence. Consider parents who know their child will have a disability causing significant suffering. Antinatalists want to say these parents harm their child by creating them. But the child cannot coherently wish their parents had acted differently because that would mean they never existed. A different action would have produced a different child entirely. So in what sense were they harmed if the only alternative was their complete non-existence? Benatar responds that the non-identity problem does not undermine his asymmetry argument. He distinguishes between person-affecting and impersonal views of morality. Person-affecting views require identifying a specific person who is made worse off by an action. Impersonal views can judge actions wrong based on states of affairs they bring about. The asymmetry argument can be formulated in impersonal terms, avoiding non-identity problems. Creating a state of affairs containing suffering is bad, even without identifying who specifically is harmed. David de Grazia suggests that we should understand harm comparatively across possible worlds. In one possible world, the child exists and experiences suffering from their condition. In another possible world, the parents refrained from procreation and the child never existed. The first world is worse than the second from the standpoint of suffering present. This comparative evaluation does not require claiming the specific child would have been better off never existing. It simply judges between world states without making person-relative claims about comparative advantage. Another response appeals to wrongful life claims in legal contexts. Courts have sometimes recognized that children can be harmed by being brought into existence with severe disabilities. These wrongful life suits do not founder on non-identity problems in practical legal reasoning. The law can recognize that creating someone in terrible circumstances wrongs them. This suggests ordinary moral reasoning can accommodate harm in procreation despite philosophical puzzles. The non-identity problem may be a theoretical artifact rather than genuine barrier to antinatalist arguments. Rivka Weinberg develops what she calls the procreative permissibility principle to navigate these issues. She argues that procreation is permissible when it satisfies two conditions. First, the parents must be motivated by appropriate reasons focused on the child's well-being. Second, procreation must achieve acceptable balance between benefits and burdens imposed. This principle attempts to preserve intuition that some procreation is wrong without embracing full antinatalism. It acknowledges that creating people raises special moral issues requiring careful justification. Antinatalists might respond that even Weinberg's modified view proves too permissive. No amount of expected benefits can justify imposing existence on someone who cannot consent. The non-identity problem does not eliminate the fundamental moral issue about unconsented imposition. Even if we cannot identify harm to a specific person, creating suffering where none existed before seems problematic. The various philanthropic arguments converge on the view that procreation fails moral scrutiny. Whether through asymmetry, consent violations, or prima facie harm, creating people appears ethically unjustifiable. Part 4. Misanthropic Arguments: Environmental Harm and Human Destructiveness. Misanthropic antinatalism argues against procreation based on harm that humans inflict on others. Benatar develops this argument alongside his philanthropic case in his 2006 book. He claims humans are a deeply flawed and destructive species responsible for immense suffering. If another species caused similar levels of destruction, we would rapidly recommend against breeding more members. Consistency requires applying the same reasoning to human reproduction. We have a presumptive duty not to create new members of species that cause vast harm. The scale of human-caused suffering to other humans throughout history defies comprehension. Wars, genocide, slavery, torture, and oppression mark every era of recorded human history. The 20th century alone witnessed deaths of over 100 million people in wars. Genocides in Armenia, Holocaust, Cambodia, Rwanda, and elsewhere killed millions deliberately. Totalitarian regimes under Stalin, Mao, and others caused tens of millions of deaths through policy. Contemporary warfare continues to generate massive civilian casualties and refugee populations. Interpersonal violence occurs at staggering rates even outside organized warfare. Millions of people are murdered each year through individual acts of violence worldwide. Domestic violence affects hundreds of millions of women and children annually. Human trafficking enslaves millions in forced labor and sexual exploitation. Child abuse, neglect, and exploitation harm countless young people in every society. The dark side of human nature produces continuous suffering inflicted by humans on other humans. Psychological research reveals disturbing truths about human conformity to harmful authority. Stanley Milgram's experiments showed that most people will administer apparently lethal electric shocks when instructed. Philip Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment demonstrated how quickly ordinary people adopt cruel behaviors in assigned roles. The Asch conformity experiments showed people deny obvious perceptual facts to agree with group. These findings suggest humans are predisposed to harm others under certain social conditions. The capacity for cruelty appears widespread rather than limited to abnormal individuals. The harm humans inflict on non-human animals dwarfs even the suffering caused to other humans. Over 70 billion land animals are slaughtered annually for food production worldwide. Fish deaths from commercial fishing number in the trillions when all species are included. Factory farming subjects billions of animals to intensive confinement, causing severe physical and psychological suffering. Animal experimentation kills over 100 million animals each year in laboratory testing. Habitat destruction from human activity drives species to extinction at rates unseen since dinosaurs disappeared. The suffering animals endure in industrial agriculture involves extreme confinement and deprivation. Chickens spend their lives in cages smaller than a sheet of paper. Pigs are confined in gestation crates where they cannot turn around for months. Dairy cows are repeatedly impregnated and separated from calves to maintain milk production. Animals are often conscious during slaughter when stunning procedures fail. The scale and intensity of this suffering is almost impossible to comprehend fully. Environmental destruction caused by humans threatens ecosystems that support all life on Earth. Climate change from carbon emissions is altering global weather patterns and raising sea levels. Deforestation eliminates habitats and reduces biodiversity at accelerating rates. Ocean acidification from absorbed carbon dioxide disrupts marine food chains. Plastic pollution now contaminates even the most remote oceanic environments. The sixth mass extinction event in Earth's history is currently underway due to human activity. Each new human being contributes significantly to environmental degradation through their lifetime consumption. The average person in developed nations produces several tons of carbon dioxide annually. This carbon emission drives climate change that will harm future humans and countless non-human animals. Resource extraction for human consumption destroys habitats and pollutes local environments. Even well-intentioned individuals cannot avoid causing substantial environmental harm through ordinary living. Creating new people multiplies these unavoidable negative impacts on the planet and its inhabitants. The presumptive duty argument claims these facts establish strong reason against procreation. We recognize duties not to create beings who will cause great harm to others. If we knew with certainty that a child would grow up to be a mass murderer, creating that child would be wrong. The harm that actual humans cause may not be as dramatic, but is far more certain. Every human will contribute to animal suffering through food consumption and environmental destruction through resource use. These guaranteed harms create a presumptive moral duty to refrain from creating new humans. Defenders of procreation might argue that humans also create substantial benefits that outweigh harms. Medical advances relieve suffering and extend healthy lifespan for millions of people. Technological innovations improve quality of life and reduce poverty in developing regions. Art, music, literature and culture enrich human experience and create lasting value. Scientific understanding advances knowledge about the universe and our place in it. These positive contributions might be thought to counterbalance the harms humans cause. Benatar responds that this defense faces severe difficulties when examined carefully. First, many of the benefits humans create simply address problems that humans themselves caused. Medical treatments are necessary largely because humans create conditions conducive to disease. Poverty relief addresses economic systems that humans constructed and that create poverty. These are not genuine benefits, but merely ameliorations of human-caused problems. Fixing problems we created does not generate net positive value. Second, the benefits humans create typically accrue primarily to other humans rather than animals or ecosystems. The harm to non-human animals from human activity vastly exceeds any benefits humans provide them. Wild animals lose habitat and face extinction, while domestic animals suffer industrial confinement. Environmental destruction harms countless organisms while benefiting primarily humans who caused the destruction. A true accounting cannot ignore these asymmetric distributions of benefits and harms across species. Human benefits to humans do not outweigh the catastrophic costs imposed on non-human life. Third, even the benefits humans provide to each other must be weighed against enormous ongoing suffering. Global poverty affects billions of people living in deprivation, despite technological progress. Preventable diseases continue killing millions annually, even with medical knowledge to stop them. Wars and violence persist despite moral progress and international institutions. The benefits are unevenly distributed, while suffering affects vast numbers across the planet. Claiming human existence generates net positive value requires ignoring most actual human experience. The misanthropic argument generates difficult questions about the value of human civilization and culture. If humans cause such vast harm, should we value human achievements like art and science? Patricia McCormack argues that humanity should voluntarily phase itself out for the planet's benefit. The voluntary human extinction movement advocates deliberate extinction through reproductive cessation. These positions extend antinatalism to its logical conclusion in human extinction advocacy. Not all antinatalists embrace extinction, but misanthropic arguments point in that direction. Critics object that misanthropic antinatalism displays concerning lack of appreciation for human worth. The position seems to treat human life as having negative value overall. This conflicts with fundamental commitments to human dignity and the value of persons. Even if humans cause harm, individual people possess intrinsic worth, deserving moral respect. Judging the human species as a net negative seems incompatible with humane ethics. The misanthropic argument may reveal more about pessimistic temperament than objective moral reasoning. Benatar replies that acknowledging harm does not require denying that individual humans have value. The misanthropic argument does not claim existing people lack worth or deserve mistreatment. It argues only that creating additional people who will inevitably cause harm is morally problematic. We can value existing humans while recognizing that creating more would multiply harmful impacts. The argument concerns the ethics of procreation specifically, not the value of human life generally. This distinction allows misanthropic antinatalism to avoid implying that existing humans lack worth. Part 5. Major critiques and philosophical responses. Challenging the asymmetry and optimism debates. The most fundamental critique of antinatalism challenges the asymmetry between pleasure and pain in non-existence. Critics argue that if absent pain is good, then absent pleasure must symmetrically be bad. There appears to be no principled reason to evaluate these absences differently. Both involve states of affairs where no subject exists to experience good or bad. Treating them asymmetrically seems arbitrary and undermines the entire antinatalist argument. Why should we accept that one absence is good while the other is merely neutral? Erik Magnusson argues that Benatar's supporting intuitions can be explained without accepting the asymmetry. Our duty not to create suffering people stems from harm aversion, not asymmetry about absent pleasure. We feel concerned about suffering on distant planets because suffering is intrinsically bad wherever it occurs. We do not feel concerned about absent happiness because nothing bad actually happens there. These intuitions reflect our general responses to suffering versus absence, not deep asymmetry in value. Alternative explanations remove the support the asymmetry purports to receive from common intuitions. Other critics note that Benatar's argument proves too much if the asymmetry holds. The logic should apply equally to all sentient creatures, not just humans. If coming into existence is always a harm, then predation in nature involves constant creation of victims. Every animal that reproduces imposes existence on offspring who will suffer and die. Consistent application would require advocating for cessation of all sentient life, not just human life. This seems to be a reductio ad absurdum, showing the argument has gone wrong somewhere. Benatar actually accepts this implication and extends his antinatalism to all sentient beings. He argues that preventing all sentient life would indeed be better than allowing suffering to continue. This is not a reductio, but simply following the argument to its logical conclusion. The fact that this conclusion seems extreme does not show it is false. Many true conclusions in ethics and philosophy initially strike people as counterintuitive. We should evaluate arguments on their logical merits, not on whether conclusions feel comfortable. The charge of pessimistic bias represents another major line of critique against antinatalism. Critics claim antinatalists selectively focus on suffering while ignoring genuine positive aspects of life. Michael Hauskeller argues that human lives contain substantial real goods beyond mere absence of pain. Loving relationships, creative accomplishments, intellectual understanding, and aesthetic experiences provide authentic value. These positive experiences are not delusions, but constitute real benefits that make life worth living. Antinatalists appear temperamentally inclined toward pessimism rather than objectively evaluating existence. Studies in positive psychology document that most people report high life satisfaction across cultures. Subjective well-being research finds that happiness is not as rare as antinatalists suggest. People adapt to both positive and negative events, maintaining relatively stable happiness levels. Even individuals facing significant challenges often report meaningful and satisfying lives. This empirical evidence challenges the antinatalist claim that suffering dominates human experience. Perhaps antinatalists project their own pessimistic outlook onto humanity generally. Benatar anticipates this objection and argues that optimism bias itself explains these satisfaction reports. Evolutionary pressures favoured individuals who remained motivated to live and reproduce despite hardships. Natural selection built psychological mechanisms that systematically overestimate life quality. The fact that most people report satisfaction is predicted by evolutionary antinatalism, not evidence against it. We should not trust self-reports of life quality, given strong biological imperatives distorting perception. The very data critics cite actually supports the antinatalist claim about pervasive optimism bias. This response generates further controversy about whose perception of life quality is accurate. Critics question whether antinatalists have special access to truth about life's value. If optimism bias affects most people, why should we trust pessimistic assessments as more accurate? Perhaps antinatalists suffer from pessimism bias that causes them to undervalue positive experiences. The debate risks becoming intractable if each side claims the other suffers distorted perception. We need independent criteria for assessing whose evaluation of life quality is more accurate. Some critics attempt to meet antinatalism on its own terms by challenging quality-of-life arguments. They grant, for argument's sake, that optimism bias exists, but question whether it undermines life's value. Even if people overestimate their happiness, many lives might still contain net positive value. The bias would need to be enormous to transform generally good lives into bad ones. Benatar needs to show not just that bias exists, but that it systematically reverses correct evaluation. This stronger claim requires evidence that optimism bias is extreme enough to flip life's overall value. Thaddeus Metz argues that antinatalism conflicts with widely shared views about meaning in life. Many people find deep meaning and purpose through their relationships, work, and creative pursuits. These meaning-making activities provide value beyond simple pleasure and pain calculus. A life might contain more suffering than pleasure, yet still be meaningful and worth living. Antinatalism ignores the dimension of meaning, focusing myopically on hedonic states alone. This restricted focus causes antinatalists to miss crucial aspects of what makes lives valuable. Benatar might respond that meaning itself requires conscious subjects who experience the meaning as valuable. Creating someone to experience meaning still imposes existence without consent and guarantees suffering. Meaning does not eliminate the ethical problems with procreation identified by philanthropic arguments. Moreover, meaning is fragile and often elusive, with many people finding life meaningless despite seeking purpose. The pursuit of meaning itself involves significant struggles, disappointments, and existential anxiety. Adding meaning to the analysis does not resolve the fundamental ethical case against procreation. The consequentialist critique questions whether antinatalist reasoning tracks genuine moral considerations. Peter Singer notes that preferences of actual beings matter for utilitarian ethics. Most people prefer to exist and would choose to be born if somehow able to decide. These actual preferences count more morally than hypothetical evaluations of non-existence. Consequentialism focuses on satisfying preferences of existing beings, not preventing existence of satisfied beings. Antinatalism seems to violate basic consequentialist commitments about what makes actions right or wrong. Deontological critiques focus on antinatalism's implications for duties and rights. Creating people does not obviously violate anyone's rights, since non-existent people have no rights to violate. Kant's categorical imperative does not clearly prohibit procreation when examined carefully. We might have duties to potential people, but these must be balanced against other moral considerations. The duty not to create suffering might be outweighed by duties to promote flourishing. Antinatalism may overemphasize one moral consideration while ignoring countervailing duties. Some critics argue that antinatalism undermines its own rational foundations. If coming into existence is always a harm, then the antinatalists themselves were harmed by being born. This raises questions about whether they can rationally advocate for views that depend on their own existence. Additionally, if humanity went extinct, no one would exist to benefit from the absence of suffering. The ultimate goal of antinatalism produces a universe containing no value at all, positive or negative. Whether a valueless universe is better than one containing both suffering and joy remains deeply controversial. Richard Carrier argues that antinatalism involves logical incoherence when examined closely. You cannot simultaneously endorse that life is better than death, but also that death is better than life. Antinatalism seems to require both positions depending on whether we are discussing existing versus potential people. This generates contradictory policy recommendations about preserving existing lives versus preventing new ones. The position cannot be consistently maintained without falling into logical contradiction. This suggests fundamental problems with the antinatalist framework beyond disagreements about empirical claims. Defenders of procreation point to goods that only exist if people exist to experience them. Scientific knowledge, artistic creation, technological innovation, and moral progress require existing humans. These goods have value independent of their hedonic effects on individual experiences. A universe containing conscious understanding of itself seems better than one containing no consciousness at all. Antinatalism would eliminate all possibility of these valuable goods by preventing any conscious beings from existing. This seems to be a decisive objection, showing antinatalism goes too far in its conclusions. Benatar responds that impersonal goods cannot outweigh personal harms to individual subjects. The value of scientific knowledge does not justify imposing existence on individuals who will suffer. We should not sacrifice individual well-being for abstract impersonal goods like knowledge or beauty. This would treat persons merely as means to achieving states of affairs, rather than as ends in themselves. The antinatalist position respects individual persons by not creating them to serve impersonal purposes. Consequentialist reasoning that ignores this violates fundamental ethical constraints against using people as mere means. Part 6. Practical implications and boundary cases. Abortion, adoption, population ethics, selective antinatalism. Antinatalism generates complex implications for the ethics of abortion that divide even antinatalists themselves. The position claims that creating people is wrong because it harms them by bringing them into existence. Abortion prevents someone from coming into existence, which antinatalism views as avoiding harm. This suggests that antinatalism supports abortion rights as preventing the harm of existence. However, the relationship between these positions is more complicated than this simple inference suggests. Abortion involves an already existing fetus, not preventing existence from scratch. Some antinatalists argue that abortion is morally required, given that existence constitutes harm. If bringing someone into existence always harms them, then preventing this harm becomes obligatory. Just as we have duties to prevent harm to existing people, we might have duties to prevent potential people from existing. This leads to the controversial conclusion that abortion is not merely permissible, but morally mandatory. Benatar himself stops short of this strong claim, arguing only that early abortion is morally required. He distinguishes between stages of fetal development where moral status changes significantly. Other antinatalists maintain that abortion's permissibility depends on when consciousness or sentience emerges. If the fetus has not yet developed capacity for suffering, abortion prevents existence without killing a sentient being. But late-term abortion might involve killing an already sentient being who can suffer. This creates a dilemma where abortion both prevents future suffering and causes present suffering. The calculus becomes murky when weighing immediate fetal suffering against lifetime of suffering prevented. Different antinatalists reach different conclusions depending on how they resolve these competing considerations. Critics note an apparent tension between antinatalism and common pro-choice arguments. Pro-choice advocates typically emphasize women's autonomy and bodily rights regarding reproductive decisions. But antinatalism seems to suggest that the primary reason for abortion is preventing harm to the potential person. This shifts focus away from women's rights to the interests of the fetus or potential person. Some feminists criticize antinatalism for potentially undermining women's autonomy in reproductive choices. Christine Overall argues that antinatalism may inadvertently support patriarchal control over women's reproductive capacity. Benatar responds that antinatalism actually supports reproductive autonomy by removing pressure to procreate. If procreation is morally problematic, then women face no moral obligation to have children. This frees women from pro-natalist social expectations that treat childbearing as mandatory. Antinatalism provides principled reasons to reject traditional gender roles centered on motherhood. Rather than undermining feminism, antinatalism offers philosophical support for reproductive freedom. Women can reject procreation without guilt, knowing they are not depriving anyone of existence. The relationship between antinatalism and adoption raises interesting questions about existing children. Antinatalists oppose creating new people, but what about caring for people who already exist? Adoption does not bring new people into existence, so it avoids the central antinatalist objection to procreation. In fact, adoption might be morally superior to procreation, even for non-antinatalists. It provides care for existing children without creating additional people who will suffer. Many antinatalists advocate adoption as an alternative for people desiring to raise children. However, some antinatalists question whether adoption is actually consistent with antinatalist principles. Adoption requires that someone previously procreated, creating the child available for adoption. Supporting adoption systems might inadvertently encourage procreation by providing safety net for unwanted children. If adoption were not available, people might be more careful about procreating in the first place. This creates a consequentialist dilemma about whether adoption reduces or increases total procreation. Most antinatalists reject this reasoning, viewing care for existing children as clearly permissible and often praiseworthy. Population ethics intersects with antinatalism in complex ways that illuminate broader questions about existence. Classical utilitarianism faces difficult questions about whether we should maximize total happiness or average happiness. Total utilitarianism suggests we should create as many happy people as possible to maximize overall well-being. Average utilitarianism suggests we should focus on making existing people happier rather than creating more people. Antinatalism rejects both views by claiming that creating people is wrong, regardless of their happiness levels. This represents a third position outside standard population ethics frameworks. Derek Parfit's work on population ethics reveals puzzling implications of different approaches. The repugnant conclusion states that vast populations with barely tolerable lives have more total utility than small, flourishing populations. Most people find this conclusion deeply counterintuitive and seek theories that avoid it. Antinatalism provides one way to escape the repugnant conclusion by rejecting procreation entirely. If creating people is wrong, then we need not worry about optimizing population size. The entire framework of maximizing utility across different population sizes becomes moot. However, antinatalism generates its own counterintuitive conclusion that some call the benign addition paradox. If preventing existence is good, then presumably reducing existing populations would also be good. But actively killing existing people seems clearly wrong on most moral theories. Antinatalists must explain why preventing new existence is required while ending existing life is prohibited. The distinction between preventing existence and ending existence becomes morally crucial but may seem arbitrary. Critics argue that no principled difference exists that can support this asymmetry in treatment. Benatar and other antinatalists draw sharp distinctions between existing and non-existing persons. Existing people have interests, plans, and preferences that death would frustrate. They also have connections to other people who would suffer from their death. Non-existent people have no interest to frustrate, and no one mourns their non-existence. These asymmetries justify different moral treatment of killing versus preventing existence. The distinction is not arbitrary, but reflects real differences in moral considerations. Selective antinatalism represents a position that accepts antinatalist reasoning for some, but not all, procreation. Rather than claiming all procreation is wrong, selective antinatalists identify conditions where creating people is impermissible. Procreation might be wrong in conditions of severe poverty, war, environmental collapse, or known genetic disorders, but procreation might be permissible or even good in favorable circumstances with low suffering risk. This moderate position attempts to preserve antinatalist insights while avoiding extreme conclusions. It treats antinatalist arguments as establishing high bar for justifying procreation rather than absolute prohibition. Critics of selective antinatalism argue that it misunderstands the antinatalist arguments. Benatar's asymmetry applies equally to all procreation, regardless of expected life quality. Even the best possible lives involve comparison where non-existence comes out ahead. The consent argument does not depend on life quality, but on impossibility of obtaining prior agreement. Selective antinatalism cherry-picks considerations while ignoring the argument's logical structure. If antinatalist reasoning works at all, it works universally without exceptions for favorable circumstances. Defenders of selective antinatalism respond that we can accept antinatalist concerns without accepting full conclusions. The arguments successfully show that procreation is morally serious and requires justification. They establish presumption against procreation that can be overcome in good conditions. This preserves valuable antinatalist insights about procreation ethics without embracing total prohibition. Selective antinatalism represents reasonable middle ground between pronatalism and radical antinatalism. It takes suffering seriously while acknowledging that some lives may justify existence despite costs. The question of whether antinatalism applies differently to humans versus other animals generates debate. Benatar extends his arguments to all sentient creatures capable of suffering. This commits him to the view that preventing animal reproduction would be good if feasible. Wild animals suffering from predation, starvation, disease, and parasites affects trillions of creatures. Preventing wild animal births would eliminate vast amounts of suffering in nature. This implication strikes many people as absurd and suggests the argument has gone wrong. However, some philosophers take wild animal suffering seriously as a real ethical problem. Jeff McMahon and Oscar Horta argue that we should consider interventions to reduce predation and suffering in nature. Preventing carnivore reproduction or modifying ecosystems to reduce suffering might be morally required. The fact that this seems extreme does not show it is wrong if the reasoning is sound. Our intuitive resistance may reflect bias toward naturalistic thinking rather than clear moral reasoning. Antinatalism forces us to confront uncomfortable implications of taking animal suffering seriously. Practical questions arise about what antinatalists should do in a world that continues procreating. Should antinatalists actively advocate for policies promoting low birth rates? Should they support contraception access, abortion rights, and education about reproductive ethics? Or should they recognize that advocating antinatalism may be counterproductive given strong resistance? Different antinatalists take different approaches to these strategic questions. Some actively promote antinatalism, while others live according to their principles without proselytizing. The voluntary human extinction movement represents the most radical practical application of antinatalist principles. Vehemti advocates for humans to voluntarily cease reproducing to allow gradual extinction. This would eliminate human-caused suffering while avoiding the ethical problems with killing existing people. The movement frames human extinction as gift to the planet and its non-human inhabitants. Critics view this as deeply misanthropic and incompatible with valuing human existence. Defenders argue it simply takes seriously the cumulative case against human procreation. Part 7. Intellectual Connections and Influences, Links to Ethics, Religion, Cognitive Science, and Evolutionary Biology. Antinatalism connects to broader debates in normative ethics about the foundations of moral reasoning. Deontological ethics emphasizes duties, rights, and categorical imperatives independent of consequences. The consent-based antinatalist argument fits naturally within deontological frameworks. It claims procreation violates a duty not to impose non-consensual harm, regardless of outcomes. Kantian ethics particularly emphasizes treating persons as ends rather than merely as means. Creating someone to experience life might violate this principle by using them for parental or cosmic purposes. Consequentialist ethics judges actions by their effects on overall well-being or utility. Benatar's asymmetry can be formulated in consequentialist terms, focused on states of affairs. Creating existence produces state-containing suffering, while preventing existence avoids this bad state. The calculus favors non-existence when properly accounting for the asymmetry. However, standard consequentialism typically supports procreation when expected well-being is positive. Antinatalists must challenge consequentialist assumptions about aggregating well-being across existence and non-existence. Virtue ethics asks what character traits and ways of living constitute human flourishing. Antinatalism challenges whether procreation can be understood as virtuous activity at all. Traditional virtue ethics treats raising families as central to good life and moral development. Antinatalism suggests this entire framework misunderstands the ethics of creating new people. Perhaps virtues like compassion and wisdom actually counsel against procreation when examined carefully. This requires fundamentally rethinking virtue ethics assumptions about human goods and flourishing. The philosophy of religion intersects with antinatalism in multiple ways across different traditions. Theodicy addresses the problem of evil, questioning how an omnipotent, benevolent God allows suffering. Antinatalism can be viewed as radical response to the problem of evil. If God knew that creation would involve suffering, divine procreation of universe becomes morally questionable. Some antinatalists argue that theodicy fails, and we should reject either God's existence or goodness. The very fact of existence containing suffering counts against traditional theistic beliefs. Gnostic and dualist religious traditions historically embraced views resembling antinatalism. Gnosticism taught that material world is flawed creation of ignorant or malevolent demiurge. True spiritual good involves escaping material existence rather than perpetuating it. The Cathars and Bogomils rejected procreation as trapping souls in corrupt material realm. These movements were suppressed by mainstream Christianity, which affirmed creation's goodness, but they represent a persistent strand of existence-denying thought within Western religious history. Buddhism's relationship with antinatalism is complex and contested among scholars. The Four Noble Truths begin with the assertion that existence involves suffering or dissatisfaction. The goal of Buddhist practice is achieving nirvana, which ends the cycle of rebirth. This rebirth negation shares conceptual ground with procreation negation in antinatalism. However, Buddhist texts do not clearly condemn procreation for laypeople as universally wrong. The relationship depends on whether nirvana represents cessation or transformation of existence. Some Buddhist philosophers interpret the tradition as implicitly antinatalist in its logic. If rebirth is suffering and nirvana is its cessation, then preventing rebirth seems desirable. Compassion for sentient beings might logically require preventing their existence. The bodhisattva ideal of saving all sentient beings could mean preventing new births. Other Buddhist thinkers reject this interpretation, viewing life as opportunity for spiritual progress. The debate reveals tensions within Buddhist thought about existence's value. Christianity generally affirms procreation as good through the command to be fruitful and multiply. Creation is declared good in Genesis, and human life is sacred in Christian doctrine. However, some Christian thinkers have expressed pessimistic views about earthly existence. Paul's letters suggest it might be better to remain unmarried, focused on spiritual matters. Certain monastic traditions viewed celibacy as spiritually superior to family life. These strands could potentially support modified antinatalist conclusions within Christian frameworks. The concept of original sin connects to antinatalist themes about existence's problematic nature. Christianity teaches that humans inherit sinful nature and face inevitable moral failure. This suggests that creating new people means creating new sinners doomed to suffer temptation. Schopenhauer explicitly cited the fall narrative as metaphysically significant truth about existence. He viewed it as recognition that existence itself results from some primordial error or wrongness. Antinatalism might be understood as taking original sin seriously as argument against procreation. Cognitive science and psychology provide insights into biases affecting judgments about procreation. Terror management theory studies how awareness of mortality shapes human cognition and behavior. People defend worldviews and pursue symbolic immortality through children to manage death anxiety. This suggests procreative decisions partly result from existential fear rather than rational choice. The drive to reproduce may reflect psychological defense mechanisms more than genuine assessment of life's value. Antinatalists can cite this research as explaining why people resist antinatalist arguments so strongly. Research on optimism bias supports Banata's claim that people overestimate their life quality. Studies show humans consistently expect future events to be more positive than base rates predict. People believe they are less likely than average to experience negative outcomes like divorce or disease. This systematic bias affects self-reported life satisfaction and retrospective life evaluation. The bias appears to be deeply rooted in human cognition and difficult to overcome. These findings from psychology lend empirical support to antinatalist claims about distorted life assessment. Evolutionary biology illuminates why organisms, including humans, are driven to reproduce despite suffering. Natural selection operates through differential reproduction, favoring traits that increase offspring production. Organisms evolved to strongly desire reproduction because ancestors who lacked this desire left fewer descendants. This means reproductive drive results from evolutionary history, not rational evaluation of life's worth. We should not mistake evolutionarily programmed desires for genuine assessments about reproduction's moral status. Evolution optimizes for reproduction, not for well-being or rational decision-making about existence. The gene-centered view of evolution suggests organisms exist as vehicles for gene propagation. Richard Dawkins famously described organisms as survival machines built by genes to ensure their replication. From this perspective, the organism's interests are subservient to genetic interests in reproduction. This creates potential conflict between what benefits organisms and what evolution programs them to desire. Antinatalists can argue that we should reject evolutionary programming when it conflicts with rational ethics. Just because evolution shaped us to reproduce does not mean reproduction is actually good. Neuroscience reveals how reward systems in the brain motivate reproductive and parenting behaviors. Dopaminergic pathways generate pleasure and motivation associated with sexual activity and bonding with offspring. These neurological mechanisms ensure that reproduction feels rewarding despite its costs. Oxytocin and other neurochemicals create powerful attachment to children that overrides other considerations. Understanding these mechanisms helps explain why people find procreation appealing despite antinatalist arguments. The brain is wired to make reproduction feel good, regardless of rational ethical analysis. Sociobiology and evolutionary psychology examine how evolved psychology shapes reproductive decisions. Humans evolved elaborate mate choice mechanisms to identify partners with good genetic qualities. Status-seeking and resource accumulation partly serve reproductive functions in evolutionary contexts. Many cultural practices and institutions emerged to regulate reproduction and parental investment. This suggests that procreative desires are deeply embedded in human social psychology. Antinatalism faces uphill battle against these powerful evolved tendencies shaping human motivation. Game theory and evolutionary stable strategies provide frameworks for analyzing reproductive decisions. Cooperation and defection in iterated games model social dynamics, including reproductive ethics. If antinatalism became widespread, individuals who defected and reproduced would gain evolutionary advantage. This creates a stability problem where universal antinatalism appears difficult to maintain. The voluntary human extinction movement faces this challenge of defection, undermining collective commitment. Game-theoretic analysis suggests antinatalism may be evolutionarily unstable strategy. The concept of evolutionary mismatch applies to modern reproductive contexts. Humans evolved in small hunter-gatherer bands with high infant mortality and different resource constraints. Modern conditions with low mortality, high resource use and dense populations differ radically from ancestral environment. Reproductive drives, adapted to ancestral contexts, may produce suboptimal outcomes in modern world. Environmental damage and overpopulation result partly from evolutionary mismatch. This supports misanthropic antinatalist arguments about harm from human reproduction in current conditions. Behavioral economics demonstrates systematic deviations from rational choice in decision-making. Loss aversion causes people to weight losses more heavily than equivalent gains. Hyperbolic discounting leads to preference for immediate rewards over larger, delayed rewards. These biases affect reproductive decisions where costs and benefits span long time horizons. People may underweight future suffering and overweight immediate desires to have children. Antinatalists can argue that rational analysis corrects for these predictable decision-making errors. The concept of adaptive preferences describes how people adjust preferences to available options. Someone in limited circumstances may develop preferences aligned with what they can actually achieve. Applied to existence, people may adapt preferences to fit the fact that they exist. Endorsement of one's own existence might reflect adaptive preference formation rather than objective evaluation. This psychological mechanism could explain why existing people generally favor existence over non-existence. It provides another reason to question whether retrospective approval justifies procreation. Part 8. Common misconceptions, limitations, and concluding analysis. A persistent misconception conflates antinatalism with depression or suicidal ideation. Critics frequently dismiss antinatalism as merely reflecting the psychological state of depressed individuals. However, antinatalism makes claims about procreation ethics, not about whether existing people should continue living. Antinatalists can value their own continued existence while opposing creation of new people. The position concerns preventing existence, not ending it for those already alive. Conflating these distinct issues misunderstands antinatalism's actual philosophical content. Research on psychological correlates of antinatalist views yields mixed and controversial results. Some studies find associations between antinatalist beliefs and depression or dark triad personality traits. However, correlation does not establish that antinatalism results from psychological pathology. Depressed individuals might perceive life's negative aspects more accurately rather than less accurately. The optimism bias research suggests non-depressed people might have distorted positive perceptions. Dismissing antinatalism based on psychology of its advocates commits genetic fallacy. Another common error treats antinatalism as equivalent to nihilism or rejection of all value. Nihilism claims nothing has meaning or value in objective sense. Antinatalism makes specific moral claims that procreation is wrong because it causes harm. This requires believing that suffering is genuinely bad and should be prevented. Far from rejecting value, antinatalism depends on strong commitments to value of avoiding harm. The position is not nihilistic, but reflects particular value judgments about existence and suffering. Some critics mistakenly believe antinatalists advocate killing existing people or forced sterilization. Philosophical antinatalism makes claims about moral permissibility of voluntary procreation. It does not endorse violence, coercion, or state enforcement of reproductive restrictions. Most antinatalists strongly oppose forced sterilization as violating bodily autonomy. The position concerns ethics of procreative choice, not advocacy for population control policies. This distinction between philosophical argument and policy prescription is crucial for understanding antinatalism. The misconception that antinatalism treats life as worthless confuses comparative and absolute claims. Antinatalism argues existence is comparatively worse than non-existence, not that life has zero value. Existing people can have valuable experiences and lead meaningful lives. The claim concerns whether creating people is justifiable, not whether existing people have worth. This comparative evaluation differs from absolute judgment that life is valueless. Conflating these distinct claims generates confusion about what antinatalism actually asserts. Some people misunderstand antinatalism as claiming individuals should regret their own existence. The philosophical position concerns whether procreation is ethically permissible going forward. Individual antinatalists may be glad they exist while maintaining procreation was wrong. Someone can believe an action was morally wrong but still prefer its actual results. This parallels how people can be glad they survived something while wishing it never happened. Personal attitudes toward one's existence remain separate from moral evaluation of procreation's permissibility. The charge of self-refutation represents a serious objection requiring careful response. If antinatalism is true, then antinatalists should not exist to argue for it. This seems to undermine the position's rational foundation in performative contradiction. However, antinatalists can coherently say they should not have been created without contradiction. Making the best of existence they were wrongly given does not refute claims about procreation's impermissibility. The self-refutation objection confuses metaphysical with epistemological and practical issues. A limitation of antinatalism concerns its implications for meaning and purpose in life. If procreation is wrong, this seems to undermine major source of meaning for many people. Family relationships and raising children provide profound purpose and fulfillment for billions of humans. Antinatalism appears to dismiss these goods as insufficient to justify procreation. This creates tension between antinatalist ethics and widespread intuitions about meaningful existence. Defenders must either reject these intuitions or explain how meaning persists without procreation. The practical impact of antinatalism remains extremely limited despite growing philosophical interest. Birth rates are declining in developed nations, but primarily due to economic and social factors. Antinatalist philosophy appears to have negligible influence on actual reproductive decisions. Most people never encounter antinatalist arguments and would reject them if they did. This raises questions about whether antinatalism represents important ethical insight or philosophical curiosity. The vast gap between philosophical argument and human behavior suggests deep limitations in antinatalism's practical relevance. Antinatalism may suffer from excessive abstraction disconnected from lived human experience. The arguments operate at high level of philosophical generality about existence, suffering, and value. But actual reproductive decisions involve complex personal, social, cultural, and emotional factors. Reducing procreation ethics to abstract calculations about harm may miss crucial dimensions. The phenomenology of parenting and family relationships involves goods difficult to capture in antinatalist frameworks. This limitation suggests antinatalism may be true in abstract but practically irrelevant. The reliance on controversial philosophical premises limits antinatalism's persuasive power. Benatar's asymmetry requires accepting non-obvious claims about evaluating absence and non-existence. The consent argument depends on particular views about when harm without consent is permissible. These foundational premises remain disputed among philosophers with no consensus emerging. Antinatalism's strength depends on accepting premises that many thoughtful people reasonably reject. This makes the position less compelling than arguments resting on widely shared moral foundations. The question of scope reveals another limitation in antinatalist reasoning. Should antinatalism apply to all sentient creatures or only humans? If all sentient life, then preventing wild animal suffering becomes required no matter how impractical. If only humans, then some principal distinction must explain why human procreation differs from animal reproduction. Neither option seems fully satisfactory without generating counterintuitive implications. This scope problem suggests that antinatalist principles may not generalize consistently across cases. Antinatalism faces challenges explaining obligations to people who will predictably exist. Even if procreation is wrong, many people will be born regardless of antinatalist arguments. We need an ethics for dealing with these future people, including intergenerational justice. Antinatalism seems to undermine concern for future generations, since preventing their existence would be better. This creates practical problems for environmental ethics and long-term planning. The position needs to accommodate obligations to future people while maintaining that creating them is wrong. The political dimensions of antinatalism remain underdeveloped in philosophical literature. How should antinatalist views inform policy on contraception access, abortion rights, and family planning? What implications does antinatalism have for immigration, population growth, and resource allocation? Most antinatalist philosophers avoid detailed policy prescriptions beyond individual reproductive choice. This leaves open questions about whether antinatalism has a coherent political program. The gap between philosophical argument and political application represents significant limitation. Despite limitations, antinatalism has forced philosophers to examine procreation ethics more carefully. Before Benatar's work, procreation received surprisingly little philosophical attention. The assumption that creating people is morally unproblematic went largely unquestioned. Antinatalism challenged this assumption and sparked productive debate about reproductive ethics. Even philosophers who reject antinatalism acknowledge it raises important questions. The contribution to philosophical discourse represents genuine value regardless of antinatalism's ultimate truth. The position reveals deep tensions in how we think about existence, value, and harm. Our intuitions about these concepts are not fully consistent when examined carefully. Antinatalism exploits these inconsistencies to generate disturbing conclusions. This exposes the need for more rigorous thinking about fundamental ethical questions. Whether we ultimately accept or reject antinatalism, engaging with it improves our ethical reasoning. The arguments force us to justify beliefs about procreation we typically take for granted. Antinatalism also highlights the profound asymmetry between prevention and causation in ethics. We treat preventing existence differently from ending it, despite both involving non-existence. We treat preventing harm differently from providing benefit in procreative contexts. These asymmetries in moral reasoning deserve careful philosophical investigation. Antinatalism brings these patterns into focus even if its own explanations prove unsatisfactory. The philosophical puzzles it raises remain important independent of antinatalism's truth. The continued debate about antinatalism reflects enduring human questions about existence itself. Why does anything exist rather than nothing at all? Is existence fundamentally good or bad for conscious beings who experience it? Should we view life as gift or burden, blessing or curse? These questions have troubled humans throughout history across all cultures. Antinatalism represents one tradition's answer to these perennial existential questions. The evolutionary explanation for resistance to antinatalism does not settle the philosophical debate. Evolution shaped us to value reproduction, but evolution optimizes for reproduction, not truth. The fact that we are programmed to reject antinatalism does not show antinatalism is false. However, the profound disconnect between antinatalist conclusions and human psychology is significant. Either antinatalism reveals truth about existence that evolution prevented us from seeing, or antinatalism reflects philosophical error disconnected from reality. This standoff between evolutionary psychology and philosophical argument remains unresolved. In final analysis, antinatalism presents sophisticated arguments that merit serious philosophical engagement. The position cannot be dismissed as depression, nihilism, or misanthropy without addressing its actual reasoning. Bennett's asymmetry, the consent argument, and misanthropic arguments all raise important ethical challenges. Whether these arguments ultimately succeed depends on evaluating complex philosophical premises about value, harm, and existence. Reasonable philosophers reach different conclusions after carefully examining the arguments. The debate will likely continue as long as humans ask fundamental questions about life's value and meaning. The practical irrelevance of antinatalism to most human reproductive decisions suggests limits to philosophy's reach. Abstract arguments, however logically compelling, often fail to move people when they conflict with deep biological imperatives. This reveals something important about the relationship between reason and human nature. We are not purely rational beings, capable of acting on philosophical conclusions that contradict evolutionary programming. Antinatalism exposes the boundaries of reason's power over human behavior. Whether this shows reason's limitations or humanity's irrationality remains an open question. Ultimately, antinatalism forces each person to confront fundamental questions about existence and ethics. Should we continue the human experiment, knowing it involves unavoidable suffering? Does the joy, beauty, knowledge, and love in life justify the pain, loss, disappointment, and death? Can we ethically impose existence on others without their consent? Do we owe it to potential people to prevent their existence, or to actual people to let humanity continue? These questions admit of no easy answers, but deserve our most careful thought.